Good day. I'm Allyson Wainer, the Director for the Center for Education. Welcome to those of you joining us today from points all around the world. Today's gathering is USAID Center for Education's kickoff event for a month-long celebration of International Literacy Day. International Literacy Day is celebrated around the world each year on September 8th. It was declared by UNESCO in 1966 and first celebrated in 1967. Its aim is to highlight the importance of literacy to individuals, communities, and societies. This year's theme is promoting literacy for a world in transition, building the foundation for sustainable and peaceful societies. It aligns with USAID's commitment to building foundational education globally so as to foster a stronger, more sustainable world. Today, we welcome the Deputy Assistant Administrator and Acting Senior Coordinator for International Basic Education in USAID Center for Education, LeAnna Marr. LeAnna will host today's event covering 3 topics related to advancing foundational learning, whether through wise investments, collaborative partnerships, or advancing literacy from a child's first language to another. LeAnna, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Allyson. And I'm so super excited to be here today with everybody. This is something new that we're trying. We really wanted to bring in a technical aspect to our celebrations for International Literacy Day. And to do that, we've convened an amazing panels of experts, and they're going to talk to us about smart buys in education, strengthening donor and partner government coordination, as well as language of instruction. So some really important topics here on the agenda today. Before we dive into the conversations, however, I'd like to reflect on a few critical developments and partnerships that USAID has been a part of for the past year. In 2022, we elevated our collaboration with the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, with UNICEF, the World Bank, UNESCO, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to form the Global Coalition for Foundational Learning. Together, we jointly published a report on global learning poverty rates, which I think was just incredibly important as we try to garner more political will to really deal with foundational learning and to lower those poverty rates. We hosted joint calls with our country-based staff to promote increased collaboration. We launched a global commitment to action on foundational learning at the 2022 Transforming Education Summit. And to date, 27 countries and 34 organizations have signed that commitment to action. We encourage all of you working on foundational learning to also sign that commitment to action. Building on the momentum from the Transforming Education Summit, the Ministries of Education in Sierra Leone and Colombia hosted knowledge exchanges earlier this year, bringing together regional and global stakeholders to participate in regional dialogue on best practices and areas for action for foundational learning skills. We're super happy to see this regional and local leadership taking up this topic. Finally, USAID launched a 10-year retrospective study on USAID's early grade reading programs that examines the impact of USAID's 2011 education strategy. This study found that from 2011 to 2021, USAID's early grade reading programs became more effective over time, with second-generation programs reaching a larger number of students, improving reading among a larger percentage of students, and having a lower average cost per student reached and per improved reader. So what we're seeing is that globally together, we're getting more effective, but also more efficient, which I think is really important. So today, our first of 3 discussions will focus on the Global Education Evidence Advisory Panel's 2023 report, Smart Buys in Education for Low and Middle Income Countries. So to have this discussion, I'll be joined by Ben Piper, who is Director of the Global Education Program at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and also Rachel Hinton, Senior Education and Social Development Advisor at the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. So welcome, Rachel and Ben, and thank you so much for joining us. To kick off this conversation, Ben, I'd like to start with you with a question and just ask you, how has the Smart Buys report stirred discussion in the education sector.
Yeah, thanks so much, LeAnna, and hi, everyone. I'm excited to celebrate with you International Literacy Day. Look, I'm in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, one of the best cities in the world. And just down the street, there's a minister who has a very big vision for what the Ethiopian education sector can do. And I think one of the main reasons that this Smart Buys report exists is to help policymakers and those supporting him, including his team, but also the development community and research community, to be able to understand how to respond to the challenges that exist in Ethiopia and any other country like it. And so, for example, one of the things that this report's release has done is kind of responded more effectively to the core policymakers' question. We got a response or a request from the minister recently. Here's my problem. What do I do? And I think this updated report does that a bit better than the previous one. It has 13,000 studies, now 400 of which have enough evidence to be able to update the 2020 paper. And the thing that's interesting about this report, LeAnna, is that it's both studies that have rigor, but also studies that have cost. And that's the window that policymakers need in particular. What's the overlap between what we know works and how much those things work? Because here in Ethiopia, this is a complex and quite large system with fiscal constraints, like many of the countries that you work in. So the report is structured so it provides some information on kind of here's the best buys, cost-effective, impact at scale, good buys, the things that we think work, but we don't have quite as strong evidence around them. And then these are the areas that are promising, but limited evidence. So as far as to answer specifically, what are the things that have stirred discussion-wise from this version of the report? Number one is this. This report updates what are the smart buys. So these are the best buys for education from a cost-effectiveness point of view. And what's different in this version is that there are two types of interventions related to literacy that have now been upgraded to a great buy, the highest ranking. And those are structured pedagogy, which means kind of the package of interventions, which includes books for kids, teachers' guides related to those books for teachers, training for teachers, and some sort of instructional support, all linked together and focused really clearly on the skills that kids need in literacy. That has been actually upgraded to a great buy that has evidence of cost effectiveness. Secondly, there's something called teaching at the right level. Many of you know it, but just for those of you who don't, this is an intervention that is allowing the classroom to be reorganized so that kids are not just grouped based on their friends, but they're grouped based on their skills, and there's instruction focused in the literacy side, whether or not you're a kid who only knows their letters, you know your letters, but you don't know how to put them together, you know how to decode, but you don't know how to comprehend. So the instruction is focused on them. So these are kind of very simple summaries of these two types of approaches that work in literacy. But what's most important is to know that for those of you who've been working on these areas, this is the new evidence would say, based on some of the studies of people in this call, that these are good buys, great buys that can actually have meaningful impacts on learning outcomes. So that's a really big difference. The second one is that there's still questions and discussion around, do we have strong enough evidence across the various ranges of things the literacy programs might do about scale? So I would say as an ex-researcher, all pseudo-researcher, or kind of researcher now, the research space is just too infrequently dependent on what happens at scale. It's a real weakness. So I personally want to prod the researchers on the room to think about designing for scale and designing for things that work within systems, including this one here in Ethiopia. There's really no need to have yet another study that shows how a perfectly implemented, overly expensive program worked, but then all of a sudden, surprisingly, it didn't scale up. And typically those reports are kind of written to blame the country or the system for not scaling up. I actually think it's a blame of program designers and us as researchers to actually design for scale, to consider the realities of what countries can and can't do, what they can and can't pay for, and then play around in that research space. I don't want to talk too long. The last one I'd say, LeAnna, as far as what discussion has been stirred, is where ed tech fits. And so actually the category that ed tech falls, there's a few different areas. On the one hand, ed tech adaptive software goes in the category called promising but limited evidence. So those of you who are interested in that area, what would it take to learn more about how to scale those things up or to have a bit more evidence? Mobile phones to support literacy learning, that's also promising but limited evidence. I think a big one that caused a lot of discussion is this issue of hardware alone, tablets, phones, all those sort of things, those ed tech interventions alone are a bad buy. And that's caused a lot of discussion because many of our countries are interested in those sort of things, and how do we help them to do it better? So back to you, LeAnna. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Ben. And you're always keeping it real and practical and bringing in a country level perspective. So really appreciate that. And also really appreciate the comments on designing for scale and the importance of that. And really, this is where we should be focusing our attention these days. So thank you. Rachel, as one of the authors of the Best Buy report, I'd like to bring you in, and I'm going to ask you kind of two questions at once. And the first one is, which buys serve as the best starting point, and what are the criteria for success? And as you're kind of talking through that, I'd also like to know if there was something interesting that you learned or that surprised you in the development of the report.
Thank you very much, LeAnna. And first, just thanks for the privilege for being part of this panel. And I'm joining from Delhi here, where there's great excitement around the G20 discussions and the importance of education as part of that as well. I wanted to first just add to Ben around what stirred discussion, because I think what's been exciting is the kind of controversy in a way that the report has actually created, because we're not very good as human beings, if you like, about shifting our investments or shifting our behaviors or shifting our beliefs. That's a difficult thing to do. And if I sort of take you back to May earlier this year, when we were in London at the Education World Forum, it was the day after that fanfare of the whole royal coronation, and we were sitting in a boardroom overlooking Westminster Abbey. You know, it's the largest gathering of ministers across the globe, and we had one delegation team in the room. There with Rukmini Banerjee, one of the panelists, Sally Grantham McGregor, an excellent expert on early childhood, and actually also Halsey Rogers giving us the World Bank's economic kind of view as well. And deep in discussion, one of the ministers turned and said, "So do you mean that we're actually investing in bad buys?" And there was a bit of a pause and silence, and we said, yes, actually, hardware alone, as Ben just noted, is a bad buy. But what was also the case, and there was then some really interesting discussion, is, well, how do you combine that then and turn that bad buy investment into something that could be promising by adding in the necessary support with coaching for teachers and the appropriate in-classroom support to raise the learning outcomes. So I think that's just one, you know, there really is, you know, a stirring of excitement around this. And another example of that was in Kenya recently, in Nairobi, with the first report of the JEEP. The USAID were also invited in afterwards by Ruth Kagir, who was the president's advisor, saying, I really want to know more. I want to understand this and see how do we shift our policy in relation to these smart buys. And there was a lot of discussion on overload of curriculum and alignment of the testing and the teaching. And then they further went on after this year's sharing of the report to invite more evidence discussion around the president's task force. And I think what's exciting here is then we're seeing the subsequent report come out showing a shifting to foundational learning that is very much aligned with those, you know, the evidence and reflects a reduction of the curriculum, which is again something governments are often very reluctant to do, and focusing more therefore on the skills than on the actual content of a curriculum. So I think you asked as well what we've learned in the sort of development of the report. I think the biggest thing, LeAnna, is something that I think USAID can be proud of, in fact, which is supporting the capture of costs. As you know, the health sector's had a measure, the DALI, for a long time, but actually it's only recently that an education sector, we have the learning adjusted years of schooling measure. It was introduced in 2018. You know, it was in the World Development Report, and it forms a core component of the Human Capital Index. But it actually it calculates and combines both the quantity and the quality of schooling into a metric of progress that we can use, and that we've used indeed in this SmartVise report. So it's calculated by the average years of schooling multiplied by the test score performance against that high performance of Singapore equivalent schools. So I think that what we found is that actually there isn't as much data as we thought, or as many reports as we thought, that would be using and capturing costs. And of the over 13,000 studies we looked at for the report, and then 400 that we ended up reporting on, only 100 had the cost measures, LeAnna. And actually, you're one of the few organizations that has made cost measurement mandatory for its programs. And I think that hard work from Hetal Thukrul's team, and Eleanor Walls and Alaka Holler at the bank in particular, putting together the cost guidance that's now available, is a really helpful starting point for all of us. And hopefully we'll continue to increase the amount of evidence that is costed. So I think we were still surprised that we've got a long way to go.
Great. Well, thank you, Rachel. And you've just raised so many important areas. I think, the cost thing, as you mentioned, and that kind of links to what Ben was saying earlier about scalability of interventions and really being able to take this to scale, the importance of not just effectiveness, but efficiency and affordability is huge. So thank you for raising that. And I just want to put in a plug. I think it's so important for all of us working in this area to be willing to share that cost data. I know it can be hard and it can be seen as sensitive, but ministries, implementing partners, donors, all of us alike have to be willing to share that cost data, I think, to move this conversation forward. So thank you for talking about that. And I would just say, the alignment and how key that is. We know that there is no silver bullet. And I think this links back to what Ben was saying around ed tech. Education is so complex, but we do know for reading, there are several things that need to be in place, from teacher training to materials, and it all has to be well linked and aligned. So thank you for that. I'm going to turn back to Ben now with a question. Ben, what are the contextual factors that might make a smart buy less or more effective, or more likely to be implemented as intended?
Yeah, thanks, LeAnna. I really feel strongly about this topic because we made sure in this version of the report, there's a section that talks about location-specific adaptation and the real work that comes after a report like this comes out. So let me put it like this. As a member of the panel, I feel strongly that we want to be clear that just because an intervention has worked in one place, and just because there's an average effect size and an average cost effectiveness measure in LAYS, as Rachel talked about, it doesn't mean it will work in yours. And the real task of a policymaker, researcher, technical assistant to government is to figure out the hard part, which is how should these evidence-based interventions be applied in my context. If you know Rachel Glenister, she has a lot of work on this idea of external validity of impact evaluations. And I think it's just common sense. As a member of the panel, these are ranked by levels, right? But within the confines of one of the best buys or the great buys or a promising but limited evidence buy, all of those things vary in your context based on the work that is required to work with government and design something well. There are so many things that matter. For those of you who are implementers, what's the right package of materials? Some of the things that are controversial might be, do you do workbooks or no workbooks? Do you do a coaching system that's using existing personnel or additional personnel? Do you have materials that are connected, integrated? Do you use color? All those things are specific to that country. On the teaching at the right level side, should you do the program using volunteers external to school or inside of school using teachers? Should the sessions come before the normal class or be integrated into the normal class? Should it come in the afternoon? What's the right size? All those things that the report starts off to give you a conversation starter and some ideas of what might work in one place. But the real work, actually the fun work, is figuring this out at the country level. So with that soapbox, I'll step off. As far as the contextual factors that matter, I think number one would be political commitment to this at the country level. Rachel talked about Kenya. There's other countries that have really shown a political commitment to implementing these programs effectively. So a smart buy might not work if you don't really have government. Now, let's be clear. Almost all donors or implementers on the field would be able to get the initial MOU. But that's very different than actually getting buy-in throughout the system. The mid-level civil servant, 3 months after your MOU is signed or your project document is approved, do they see the work of that program, of that intervention as fundamental to them, or is it still external? So I really feel like the sector has lost a little bit of a focus on instructional quality is what matters. I think that's what's exciting about this new version of the report, that there's an increase in the salience of instructional quality programs. But political commitment doesn't just mean the minister buying in, but being able to integrate the tasks that mid-level civil servant has to do to how the program works. The second thing I'd say, LeAnna, as far as contextual factors, is have you thought about what are the technical assistance mechanisms that will actually work in that country and integrate into the existing system? There's real balances, and different partners on the call do this differently. How much are we providing that support using external personnel? How much are we training up existing personnel to be more effective on technical things? Getting the package of technical support inside of government, alongside of government rights, really does matter. And some programs that are called the same title as something in this Smart Buys report can be ineffective because this doesn't work well. And then secondly, be very effective because they've thought carefully about how this technical things would work. Last point is this issue of learning at scale. There's a partner of ours has developed a study called Learning at Scale. And as I mentioned earlier, I just want to highlight again that this is a real task to think about, not just getting evidence, but evidence has cost, and also cost to think about how this works inside. And there's a growing bit of research on this. And I really would encourage people to consider that, because this will really make a difference as to whether or not these programs work as intended. And last small plug is just the ability of having data throughout the system. One of our partners, or a couple of our partners in India, have really worked well with the state level governments of several states to be able to create state level data mechanisms to observe how well teachers are implementing, to have student outcomes results that are daily updated, and being able to hold the system accountable. So I think we're learning a lot more, particularly given people on the call and partners on the call, including USAID, led by USAID for many years. We've really learned a lot about how this works, but the task of figuring out how the data system and monitoring system works, that's really a design question that needs to be updated. Thanks, LeAnna.
Great, Ben, and all just such important points that you're raising. I think also this idea of political commitment and will, part of what we're trying to do with the Foundational Learning Coalition. Rachel, we just have a minute or two left for this panel, so I'd just like to turn it back to you and ask if there's any last thoughts you have or anything from the report you would like to highlight for us today.
I think that I'd just like to add to Ben's point about how important having more information on scale is. And I think good examples of sustained system-wide reform are actually really rare. And I think that issue of political leadership is something we need to pay attention to. One really great example, of course, is that the Brazilian state of Ceará, where they made remarkable gains despite being one of the poorest performing states. They went from 49% of 7-year-olds in 2001 being able to read. Within 3 years, they were to 92% for that same age group. And that actually is about this combination of applying a combination of these smart buys and the great buys. And so I think my last point would just be, I think we really need now more, not just on what works, but how works. And it will require new implementation science to understand all those contextual factors that Ben talked about. So I think it's an exciting moment. That same coalition that you spoke about, LeAnna, of foundational learning players, we've recently launched now the What Works Hub for Global Education. And it's a longer term, at least 6-year program, helping governments really understand implementation science. So I would just say, I really think USAID and your partners are really going to be key, those people who are at country level, helping us get more research done that's costed, not just on the what, but also on the how.
Right. Well, Ben and Rachel, thank you so much for setting the stage for this discussion today. Thank you so much for all the work you're doing around the best buys, and what great partners you've been with USAID and others on this endeavor. So thank you for that. And speaking of the importance of coordination and country level work, we are going to be moving to a country level discussion after this brief video interlude. Thanks. And actually, again, we're going to move to discuss some country level coordination and some best practices. And to do that, we have Dorothy Matiti, who is the Education Program Management Specialist at USAID Malawi. And Malawi has been doing some extraordinary work around coordination, led by the government, the Ministry of Education there. So during the next few minutes, we'll talk about coordination of donor and national government efforts to make progress in foundational learning skills. So Dorothy, welcome so much. And I would like to just start by asking you, so Malawi has made progress recently in improving donor coordination efforts that aim to improve learners' acquisition of foundational skills. Could you describe the context of foundational learning in Malawi and what a more coordinated approach could potentially achieve?
Thanks so much, LeAnna. I was supposed to be joined with the Secretary for Education. Somebody is trying to join. I hope you'll join, but I'll give you the context of this foundational learning. Malawi, first of all, recognizes foundational learning as a priority for the government of Malawi. As a result, from 2016, Malawi government introduced the National Reading Program targeting standards 1 to 4 learners, and USAID became part of that journey. We started together looking at improving the foundational learning skills, the reading skills of these learners. And this commitment was also emphasized at the 2022 Transforming Education Summit, where the president of the Malawi committed to transform education through the 5 action tracks of the summit declaration. And after that declaration, at country level, the Ministry of Education developed a 5-strand foundational learning strategy framework that touches of support to standard 1 to 4 teachers, improving teacher training and deployment, redesigning curriculum and improving its resourcing, expanding school feeding from 30% to 100%, and to digitalize education. So this commitment still goes on, because in February 2022, the Malawi government went to a summit in Sierra Leone, Freetown, where they also highlighted its priority by endorsing and signing commitment to action on the foundational learning. So from this commitment, you find that Malawi looked at how best can we coordinate the approach to engage support from all different donors. If you look at the setup of Malawi, you find that most partners, including us, USAID, are supporting the foundational learning. USAID currently is supporting foundational learning from pre-primary up to standard 2. We moved down from standard 1 to 4 to standard 2. So what was happening was every cooperating partner, every development partner was working in silos. So we work on the literacy, FCDO will work on the numeracy. There were other people that were looking at other areas. But after these declarations, the coordinated approach is that the Malawi government, through Secretary for Education, looked at the issue of introducing Foundational Learning Steering Committee as a hub, as a driver of all the efforts towards foundational learning. And because we realized that without a coordinated effort, there was a lot of duplication of efforts. We were overwhelming the ministry people and other partners like teachers, parents, community leaders. And there was also overscheduling of activities. We were also affected by missed opportunities to work together and share resources and share data, share research findings, all those things. And sometimes you'd find that we were competing for the same people at the same time. So you'd find us canceling our activities because you organize something, you find FCDO or UNICEF or World Bank or JBJ looking at the same type of people. So with that, we felt the best thing to do is to work together so that every partner that is in that space recognizes that we are supporting the ministry vision, and then the ministry should take the priority in all these things. So we, as I said, we launched the Foundation Learning Steering Committee in April last year. That was the first meeting. It was very successful. Under that steering committee, we identified strands related to the 5 strategies that I've mentioned already. And these strands are coordinated at the departmental level. The department heads responsible for each of the strands leads the discussions, leads the subcommittees. I think I can stop there and wait if you have other questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Dorothy. And I understand we've been having a little tech issues getting the Ministry of Education folks to join. So appreciate your stepping in to discuss all of this. I think, when you talk about school feeding and so many other priorities that are so important, if we're really going to move the needle on foundational learning, again, it speaks to this complexity of having any type of results with the education system. And this, I think sometimes too, the first thing we do when we're designing new programs is try to set up a steering group within the ministry for a specific program. And I love what Malawi is doing with the ministry really driving the coordination. I know sometimes donors can be a little bit hard to herd, like stray cats a little bit. But this idea that you have a foundational learning that encompasses all of it to be coordinated and coordinating your approaches, that just seems like such a great best practice for the rest of us to learn. So I think what I'd like to ask you is, in addition to improving donor coordination, what else is needed to move the needle on improving learning outcomes? What have you seen in Malawi? Dorothy, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, apart from improving donor coordination, as I said, one of the things that we see as something that can improve and move the needle is trying to bring everybody on board. So you find that the Foundation Learning Steering Committee, what it does is it sets a clear strategy and a vision for improving this strategy as foundational learning. What we see is that all actors that are participating in this have to understand the ministry, make sure that they understand the ministry priorities, because there are so many donors in Malawi, some of them in just a small area, some of us in the countrywide. But what we need is for the Ministry of Education to provide a clear strategy and vision to all partners, either development partners, NGOs, civil society, so that we all have a unified agenda. We serve the same agenda. And then we also are trying to look at how can we leverage the issue of resources? What synergies are there? Because, for instance, if I can give you an example, we have a national reading program in Standard 1 and 2, which is supported by USAID. But we also have FCDO supporting national numerous program. And we have BFIT, which is supporting the issue of technology. So we're looking at, if we're buying a laptop, probably not a laptop, but a tablet for a school, for a teacher, how can that tablet save everybody in the space so that the other resources can be used for other things? We also noted that maybe the best thing too is to look at how we can share research evidence and at the same time look at how we share data. We have seen development partners and other NGOs going into the space trying to collect data. But if you look at within the development partners, one partner already has that data. So one of the issues that we want to do is to prioritize higher level leadership, because if every one of us passes through the Ministry of Education, definitely we'll know what is available and what is not available. And then we'll provide the very needed support that we need. The Foundation Learning Steering Committee, we wanted to have a change because previously we had the National Reading Program Steering Committee, and we also had the National Numerous Program Steering Committee, where when we meet and we have the Basic Education Technical Working Group. So we said, with this Foundation Learning Steering Committee, let's make it a place where we are not providing activity level updates. Those can be done at strand level. But let's make this a place where the partners map their work, how they support each of the strands, and then we call for discussion to leverage resources, but at the same time to push for accountability across Ministry of Education directorates and partners, and at the same time, how these can support improvement of the foundational learning, and how whatever we do can lead into the high level decision making for improvement in the foundation learning space.
Great. Dorothy, you just raised so many important things in such a short time. And I love this emphasis on not just sharing resources, but sharing research and data and how important that is. We all know that education is a hugely underfunded sector. There's a ginormous global financing gap. And so the sharing of resources, non-duplication is so important. And lastly, the accountability piece is also critically important. So all really amazing points that you bring up, critical for us to think about. So I thank you very much for joining us today. And we'll get ready now for a quick video before moving to our third panel on language of instruction. Thank you, Dorothy.
Thanks for inviting Malawi to participate.
Great. So we are back for the third and final panel today. It's a topic that I know I've spoken to many of you about, something I'm quite interested in myself, so I'm really excited for this panel. Our final conversation is going to be on language of instruction, and I will be welcoming Pooja Reddy Nakamura, who is a principal researcher in the International Development Division at the American Institutes of Research. And I'll also be welcoming our own Marcia Davidson, who is a senior education advisor here at USAID. So good morning, hello to both of you. And I'm going to start, I'm just going to leap right into this because I'm sure we have a lot to say on this. Pooja, I'd like to start with you. What are the top 2 insights or pieces of evidence on language of instruction that you wish everyone working in the sector knew and used in their work?
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having us here today, LeAnna. This is a great conversation, and hi to everyone. So really quickly, top two insights. One is, well, before I go to the insights, all foundational learning happens through language. That's not an insight. That's a key part of understanding what foundational learning is. It happens through language. So the first insight that's very now rigorously researched is that you have to teach a child to learn to read, write, and learn their foundational numeracy skills in a language they understand and use. That statement is very well understood, very widely accepted. And we are doing it so much more these days that we have local language instruction for beginning foundational learning. But are we really, really able to have evidence-based decisions on what that first language is in situations of linguistic heterogeneity, in situations of urban context? Are we really making decisions on that first language based on evidence? Or are we taking it based off of census data, or are we taking it based off of anecdotal data or political desire for a particular language? So by that, we've made great strides in that portion of it. The second piece, though, is there's a true and evidence-based tension between local language instruction for a longer and longer time and the need for socioeconomic language, the language of socioeconomic mobility, the post-colonial language, which is also linked to the ability to do better in society. So there's a high demand for that. So then the question becomes, do we know when and how to transition from one language to another? And what I want to highlight is that the local language is actually the cheapest, talking about smart buys, fastest and quickest way to get a child to learn to read and write in a new language. They transfer their skills from one language to another. And for us to start thinking about bilingualism and multilingualism as a resource and not an obstacle, and to bake it into our programming right from the beginning, right? So how are we thinking about that transition that's going to happen later anyway, but ensuring that the first language is taught to children in languages they use and understand?
Great, Pooja, thank you so much. And I think, this kind of harkens back to some of what we've heard other panelists speaking about the design, the good design of programs, and the need to be thinking about this transition from day one, even if we're working on local language of instruction, just so critical and so important. So thank you for raising that. Marcia, I'd like to turn to you now. And thinking about the Smart Buys report that we discussed earlier, what are the best cost and sustainability practices for programs that include multiple languages of instruction, especially for programs that include development and distribution of teaching and learning materials?
Thank you, LeAnna, and hello to everyone. It's wonderful to be here today. That's a great question that you're asking about the Smart Buys, and I think there are a couple of things that I want to raise in terms of Smart Buys and looking at multiple languages of instruction. And one of them has to do with the issue of equity. And I want to start by bringing up an example of some data that a colleague and I have been analyzing from a former USAID early grade reading project, in which we looked at disaggregating the data by groups of learners at the very baseline, the very beginning of this reading intervention, and looking at the language, their first language, their home language, and then looking at their learning progress during this reading intervention. What I wanted to say is that it has sort of struck me as sort of fitting very well with the idea of the Smart Buys, but what we found is that the lowest performing group of learners at the beginning of the project, most of those children, over 70%, did not speak or understand the language of instruction or assessment. But the middle group, which were sort of the beginning decoder group of children, there was a lower proportion for whom they did not speak the language. More of them spoke the language of instruction and assessment, and the highest performing group at baseline were fluent in the language of instruction and assessment. But we followed this group these classes over 2 years. And what we were trying to look at was the path to reading comprehension, which Pooja so elegantly sort of described. That's sort of the goal. That's where we are with foundational learning. So what happened with these groups of learners in terms of their progress? And what happened was that the lowest performing children at the beginning had no path to reading comprehension after 2 years of instruction, whereas the very beginning decoders, those that had started out with some knowledge in that language of instruction, and those who were pretty good at the beginning, they all progressed to a path and had a path to reading comprehension. And I think for me that equity issue becomes really critical. And the way we support children, if we have multiple languages and we are unable to teach every single child in a language they speak and understand, which is what we should be doing, then we have to provide the supports and the kind of, in a smart buy perspective, from a structured pedagogical perspective, supporting teachers to know the strategies that need to be in place to support those children who are really struggling learners to become children with opportunities to become proficient readers. So I think that idea of that progress, providing teacher support through structured pedagogy, through with teaching and learning materials, we know that teaching the tool skills, like the decoding skills, are easily transferable to the language of society or the national official language. But we also know that it's language comprehension and oral language then, and the reading comprehension components, those unconstrained skills that need to be built carefully and over a longer period of time, that need a lot of support. So that structured pedagogical piece for teachers must include a lot of oral language opportunities for children to build oral language from the very, very beginning. I think the other piece that's so important has to do with ensuring that we are checking student learning progress. Like the children that didn't progress over 2 years, it would have been ideal, and we should have known early on, so we could have provided additional support. So assessment and teaching learning materials, teaching them at their learning level. Those struggling children needed more. They needed something at their level so that pathway to reading comprehension might be possible for them. So both structured pedagogy and teaching at the learners' levels, to me, are really critically important for supporting children in their language of instruction and in the process of transition as well. Thank you.
Great. Marcia, you raised so many important things here, the equity issues. And for USAID, one of the primary objectives of our education policy is reaching the most marginalized students and making sure that they have the opportunity to learn. And so I think this is just really compelling what you're talking about, this local research and this data in countries. I just think first of all, we're sitting on a gold mine of data with that EGRA. So I love hearing about people using it, analyzing it. But this 70% that did not speak language of instruction, I think there's a key takeaway for all of us here. I think it's also crucial as we talk about, and linking back to some of what Ben and others were saying, and Dorothy, about building political will. And we know that for most ministers of education and governments, what they want to see is data and research generated in their own countries. That is what's most compelling. And I just can't help but think this 70% you quote here, how compelling that would be to leaders in countries. So we have about 2 minutes left. And what I'd like to do is give you each a chance just to highlight anything you think is most important or a key takeaway you want people to take from this session around language of instruction. And Pooja, why don't we start with you on that?
Great, thank you. So the first one is that multilingualism is an incredible resource. I know I said that before. And so one of the things that I haven't really touched on and I want to spend a minute on is the fact that we are starting to unpack evidence now that L1 skills actually have a threshold level of readiness for L2. So we're starting to not only understand what we've understood for like several decades that the first language is critical for the second language, but how much of it? Because this is one of the biggest policy questions later, is like, we know that the first language is important, but how do we convert that into a grade-based decision for introducing a new language? And this actually ties back into the smart buys and teaching at the right level and making sure we have cost-effective approaches. Even for language of instruction, we should be thinking about it as skill-based transitioning as opposed to grade-based transitioning, because just like with the other skills, language itself also has these different levels. And we know this now across languages. So I think it's really critical to think about skill-based, multilingual transition models as they fit into those best buys, as they fit into cost-effective approaches and teaching at the right level, at the right language across languages. So I'll say that and pass it over to Marcia.
Great.
Thank you, Pooja. Do you want to say something first, LeAnna? Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I just want to quickly mention, I know we're near end of time, but one of the things I'm very excited about the research that Pooja's doing, and I know it's going to be of great value in all of our planning for designs. But I wanted to say just one little piece that I think is of great interest and hope to us. And it's another little piece of research that was done when I was working in Ghana on the learning project there, and we when we looked at data again, we were looking at the progress of children. We were teaching in 11 local languages in a scaled project there, and interestingly, the assessment was done in the local language and also in English. So the EGRA was done in both languages, even though there was no English instruction during the intervention. It was all local language. And I just wanted to encourage folks, and I think many of you are very aware of this, but just to keep in mind that progress that children were making in learning to read in their home language, that progress was reflected in progress in English, with no instruction in English occurring, but the EGRA had significant improvements in English for those children across the 11 local languages. So I just wanted to say that the benefits are so extraordinary and so important when one begins teaching with teaching children in languages that they speak and understand. Thank you.
Right. So Pooja and Marcia, thank you so much. This, I think, is kind of the next frontier for many of us. I'm thinking about multi-language instruction. So thank you for being here today. So this is the end of our panels, and I think that you've given us all food for thought, and this was probably more like tasty appetizers for deeper conversations that need to continue to happen in this sector. Ben, Rachel, Dorothy, Pooja, and Marcia, I want to thank each and every one of you, not only just for being on our panel today, but for being leaders in this sector and for leading that global conversation with data and research. So with that, Allyson, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, LeAnna. It was a pleasure to listen in on the engaging conversations over such important and current issues those of us in education are working on together. We're all walking away with fresh insights and key takeaways to advance learning outcomes worldwide. I want to thank our staff at the Center for Education who have worked so hard to make this event possible. I also want to thank again our special guests who gave their time and energies to join us today, and to those who have tuned in as well, who are also tirelessly working to ensure the access to resilient, quality, and inclusive education is providing learners with the opportunities that they need to attain overall well-being, and that begins with literacy. I invite everyone to our special literacy page on Education Links to see what else is planned this month in celebration of International Literacy Day. And don't forget to follow us on our social media channels, as we have some really exciting messages from surprise literacy champions this month. I promise you won't want to miss them. Thanks again for joining us. And please remember to follow USAID literacy and foundational learning activities, events, and resources on a special page on education links. Again, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to our continued partnership as we improve and tackle literacy challenges around the world. Thanks.